Welcome to Shattering Myths, a program devoted to the most important and indeed the fastest growing segment of the world's societies. To those who have coming to know that the world's political, religious, media, military, and economic institutions are corrupt, that they're feeding us a pile of lies, that most of them, if not all of them, are counterproductive, and most importantly, that they cannot be fixed. Our mission, therefore, is to look behind the headlines, to know who is working against our interest, to understand why they are doing so. Because, my friends, ultimately exposing and condemning errant and treacherous schemes isn't hateful, it's caring. In our concluding hour, we're going to use evidence and reason to explore Yahowah's Torah. It does not mean law. There is no Hebrew word for obey. So, relax. It means teaching, instruction, guidance. It is from our Heavenly Father. He is offering an extraordinary gift, His covenant. He'd like you to participate in it, and He's willing to tell you how. Our phone number, if you'd like to engage in this discussion at any time over the next 3 hours, it's toll-free, 877-300-7645. Ultimately, it all comes down to this. Are you willing to go where the evidence leads, even if a rational evaluation of the evidence that's available to us leads to a complete repudiation of your political and religious beliefs? If the answer is yes, welcome to the show. If it is not, then perhaps we will trigger you to move in that direction. Open your mind as we present this commentary on the news during the first hour. Before I get to the news, I had reminded our audience twice that I was going to be on the Man-Cow show earlier today. That occurred. And typically I don't promote interviews. I've done so many of them, and you never know how a host is going to respond, because what I've come to learn from Yahowah and from the evidence, it leads to a place that is really unpopular with so many people, and you never know how they're going to respond to that. And so I'm a little leery of promoting and recommending folks listen to an interview. This one took place a little earlier than what I had anticipated, but was extraordinary. It was one of the most memorable discussions that I've had, one of the most intriguing, enlightening, useful, productive discussions I've had with a syndicated host in a very, very long time. I admire Man-Cow at a personal sacrifice, being willing to be blunt and bold regarding Islam. He was the most outspoken in his correct presentation of the nature of the religion and how it leads to terrorism and to what its goals are, which is the conquest of all humanity, having everyone submit to Allah and Islam, and that Allah was modeled after Satan. He is the most bold, blunt, and articulate of any nationally syndicated host. And for him to do that, for him to be willing to risk his own career and his life to tell his listeners the truth, is indeed exceptional. He should have all of our support for being willing to do that. The other aspect of the interview was eye-opening for him. I'm sure it was for his listeners. I'm sure he will get an enormous amount of flack for it. But we discussed the realization that Paul was a false prophet, that Yahowah can be trusted, that he can be known through prophecy, and that he proved that he inspired the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, so that he demonstrated conclusively that we can trust what he has to say, that he is not religious, and that he provided a prophetic portrait of the events that we're witnessing in the world today, including and especially what we're witnessing in Syria and where that's going to lead. We discussed that during the program, and we discussed how that means that Paul lied when he negated that Torah. We discussed that the fact there is no Jesus, but there is a Yahusha, and what that means. And so it was a very different kind of interview from the ones that I'm accustomed to having, with a very bright, very articulate, passionate individual. We'll see where it leads. I would love to have the opportunity to work with him publicly as it relates to Islam, and privately as it relates to his relationship with Yahowah. With that said, yesterday we were considering the protests around the world. There is more news on Bosnia. Police clashed with demonstrators in the second straight day of economic protests in Bosnia's third largest city. The Balkan Insight reports the unrest is also spreading to other cities. Bosnia was created because Muslims did not want to coexist with non-Muslims in the Balkans, just as Albania was created. It's an artificial construct created on religious intolerance on behalf of Muslims. It is amongst the most failed states in the world. It is an absolute unmitigated disaster by any standard. The world came to recognize falsely, came to accept falsely, that the Serbs were not justified and their intolerance of the Muslims. And you have to view actions and response to have an appreciation for this. Did the Christian Serbs act badly towards the Muslims in the last decade or so? Yes. In the context with what happened in the last 100 years? No. But nonetheless, the world has this myopic view, this inability to witness anything, to understand anything in context. That's why we foolishly invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. That's why we foolishly invaded Vietnam before that, and Korea before that. That's why we actually left Europe worse than we found it rather than better. And as it relates to this part of the world, the Serbs, particularly Serbian Christians, even more than Jews, were abused at the same level, same percentage of society that we witnessed Jews being abused by the Nazis in World War II. And during World War II, 800,000 of them were savaged by Bosnian Muslims. And it is a result of having 800,000 of their kin die in concentration camps, mutilated by the Muslims that joined with Adolf Hitler in the Waffen SS, that they are so focused on not tolerating any aspect of Islamic influence in their lives. That's why they lashed back out. It was a response. It's what we're witnessing right now in the Central African Republic, where the world is so fearful that Muslims are being murdered, but they weren't concerned that Christians were being murdered. You know, when the Central African Republic fell to Islam and Islamic militants were able to ravage the country at will, they burned homes and Christians and killed churches and killed tens of thousands of Christians. When the Christians respond, now that the Islamic government has been discredited, the world wants to come to the aid of the Muslims. Now, Bosnia is an example of that. And it's a place that we ought to watch carefully because it is in the Balkans. Yesterday, as I emphasized the news out of Macedonia, and something that I've got many more things to reveal to you about Macedonia. The reason I brought that to your attention is that the Torahless one that is thought to be by the misnomer Antichrist by Christians, the Torahless one that's going to rise in popularity, he's going to come from Macedonia. And so we should not be surprised, because I have shared that the prophecies indicate that he's going to have a Muslim father. He's going to have a Christian mother. And that he is going to be educated at a socialist, secularist university. that he's going to blend all of that together, that he's going to be the peacemaker in a country right now that is about to explode. Macedonia is amongst the least stable countries in the world, and it's a country that, like the Georgian Republic, is stunningly religious and overwhelmingly patriotic. Maybe the single most prolific upwelling of patriotism anywhere in the world is taking place right now in Macedonia. It's all the kinds of things that we would expect for the rise of this leader. And he's going to bring peace in his country between those three desperate viewpoints: secular humanism, Christianity, and Islam. And then he's going to glue back together some of the broken pieces out of Yugoslavia, which is where Macedonia came from, and out of Czechoslovakia. And they will then become the basis of his 10-nation confederacy. So if you're looking for this fellow, he is in his late 20s, early 30s, probably educated at Cambridge, Oxford, Princeton, Yale, or Harvard, maybe even Stanford. He is a shining star in politics there now. Probably has a Muslim father, a Christian mother. Handsome, articulate. That's where you're going to find him. He's there now. Be interesting to continue to review the news from this area. Now, as we move one more just statement out of Macedonia in fact, I have two here that I thought I'd share with you this morning. The Macedonian Daily said, in a scandalous statement, the head of the Islamic religious community, IVZ, in Macedonia, Suleiman Rexhepi, said on his social networks site that the mayor of the capital, Marjan Restiki, faces the death penalty from Allah. The stakes are being raised. Now, as we return from the commercial break, I'm going to report something that was in the news from James Clapper. You will recall that James Clapper is the U.S. National Security Intelligence Advisor, and what he had to say about Macedonia. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're considering Macedonia. European analysts, according to this article, speaking for the Daily, this would be the Daily Macedonian, in large part agree with the predictions of the U.S. National Intelligence Advisor, James R. Clapper, for the region. This was presented recently before the United States Senate. Now, you've got to remember that James Clapper is a perjurer, that he has deliberately and knowingly lied under oath. So you always have to take what James R. Clapper has to say with a hefty dose of salt. In them, Clapper particularly pointed out Bosnia and Herzegovina and Macedonia as potentially volatile on the basis of their deep political and ethnic divides. Why don't you just say religious divides? This was the first time that Macedonia was mentioned at the same level with Bosnia, which many regard as a non-functioning country, and as a artificial political creation which is at the brink of dissolution. And that's true. And that's Bosnia is non-functioning. It's an artificial construct. It is at the brink of its demise, which may well play into the 3-nation and then 10-nation confederacy. In his forecast about Macedonia, Clapper also says that the Macedonian government continues to push forward a platform of ethnic Macedonian nationalism that harms the country's EU integration. It is true that Macedonia is now becoming stunningly patriotic. That would be the word nationalism can be replaced with patriotic, in the sense of we're superior. This mythos that we're better, we're deserving. Patriotism is what often leads to conquests of land, conquests of other people's possessions. It often leads to war. It's a very, very dangerous thing. In fact, nationalism and patriotism are the very things that Yahowah asks us to walk away from if we want to participate in the covenant. Anyway, it says that the Macedonian government continues to push forward a platform of ethnic Macedonian nationalism. This is a Greeks and I have to Google it, but my guess is that in Macedonia it's the Greek Orthodox Church that they are participants in. And that's kind of interesting if that's true, which means that their Christianity will go right back to Constantine, the warrior pope, who was the first to establish Christianity as a politicized religion, where hearing Satan speak from his primary guise, the sun, with his pagan cross superimposed on it, saying, "In this sign, conquer." It takes them right back to the roots of a militant, patriotic, nationalistic religion. But he says that that this nationalism harms their European Union integration, because the whole concept of the European integration is amalgamation, is taking the nationalism of countries and trying to blend it into a greater whole, where a country with overt patriotism and nationalism would not be effectively blended into the whole. Also, there's a dispute, as you might expect, because when you say a country of Macedonia, you would say, well, that country has been around for a very long time. You know, that's the Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, after all. But the realization is that it was carved out of the dissection of Yugoslavia, and the Greeks are up in arms that this country usurped its name. Now, that's not really true in the sense that the Greeks were actually known as Hellenes, and that named after the goddess, and that they were not named Greeks. So then they chose the name Greeks because it was a moniker that was applied later to them, and they have chosen to not use Macedonia, so the name is certainly available. Clapper also said that the ethnic tensions between Macedonians and the Albanians is growing, and it needs to be thwarted for integration. It will never be thwarted. CNN reports that a former U.S. soldier who was convicted 5 years ago of murdering an entire Iraqi family died on Saturday, 2 days after an apparent suicide attempt in his Arizona prison cell. Stephen Green was found unresponsive Thursday, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. You see, he committed suicide because he was found guilty of raping a 14-year-old Iraqi girl, murdering her parents, her 6-year-old sister, along with her. It is a repulsive story. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. This is a horrible story, but it's indicative of what went wrong in Iraq and in Afghanistan. It's not to suggest that every American was a rapist, but, you know, for us to dismiss it and say it was an isolated incident where this man raped a 14-year-old girl, a U.S. soldier, not only raped a 14-year-old girl, but didn't just leave the girl having been raped. He murdered her. And then he murdered her 6-year-old sister. And then he murdered both of her parents. It is devastating what the man did. And he committed suicide. The world's better off without him. But when you read reports, Swan happens to be a good source of information. But also are all of the testimony that's made to the U.S. Senate and Congress on this subject. When you study the history, most recent history of sexual assaults in the U.S. military, you find that a woman in the U.S. military is about 80% likely to be sexually assaulted. And when she is, the most egregious crime will be that the military then attacks her credibility, her legitimacy. And it's only 1% of the rapists in the U.S. military, where rape is a pandemic, are actually prosecuted and convicted. It's a good old boys club that is condoning this horrific treatment of women. And because, in fact, I should say that those who are the closest to this, those who have studied it the most thoroughly, have just said, if you are a rapist, the place you want to go is the U.S. military, because you'll be able to rape with impunity and you'll never be punished for it. It's an extraordinarily sad situation that our troops are raping our own troops. And so we should not be surprised when we find a soldier having raped a 14-year-old Iraqi girl. This also highlights the study we did on suicides. There is this myth that, the Iraqi war and the Afghani war weren't all that deadly. We only lost 7,000 American troops. That's not even remotely true. First of all, they're only counting actual troop deaths in combat, as opposed to counting the bodies that have come back mutilated, as opposed to also counting Americans supporting the American military effort who were killed but were not active duty, which doubles that number. But what they're not counting at all is those who took their life after returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, after having witnessed what is not only an unwinnable war, but a counterproductive invasion, a suicidal invasion, where we made a vastly bad situation vastly worse, where they witnessed the very people that they were told they were liberating trying to kill them, where there was no army to fight, there were no soldiers to fight, only civilians, and that everything they had been told about Islam proved to be untrue. And so you're thrown into this whole cadre of lies by your country, and you witness some of the most horrific things, and you come back and returning soldiers are taking their lives at an alarming rate. As we discovered, of the 40% of U.S. states that actually report suicide deaths by returning U.S. troops, 40% of the states are reporting that 22 Americans are taking their lives each day in suicide. But it's worse than just 40% of the states reporting this information and the other 60 silent on the issue. It's that even the states that are reporting are admitting that they're missing at least 30% of the veteran suicide deaths. Now, if you take 22 suicide deaths per day and divide it by 0.4 to get the number if every state was reporting, and divide that by 0.7 to equate to those that are admittedly not counted even in those states that are reporting, you get just shy of 80 per day. When you multiply that by 365 days a year in the 10 years that the troops have been coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, the total is north of 250,000, which means that the ultimate death toll of our ill-advised, counterproductive invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq are second and third only to World War II and the Civil War. This is not an isolated case, what happened to Stephen Green. There was an editorial posted on CNN that was written by a man with an extraordinarily jaundiced view. His name is Fa'ad Nazar. He is a terrorism analyst and former political analyst at the Saudi embassy in Washington. Yes, he is a tool of Saudi Arabian Islam. CNN was right to, after that introduction, to say the opinions expressed in this commentary are solely his. Well, they're his, and the other fascist Islamic dictators that rule over their personal fiefdoms throughout the Arabian Peninsula. CNN, his editorial. Amid the continuing bloodshed and turmoil in Syria, one thing is becoming clear, and that when you hear that, you, from a person with a jaundiced point of view, you recognize he's about to lie to you. The Assad regime's propaganda campaign against the opposition is resonating with some countries in the West and elsewhere. No, it's not resonating. It should, but it's not. What Assad is saying is that, yeah, I might not be the nicest guy in the world, but the savages that are pouring in from countries around the world, that are being armed by the Saudi Arabians, the United States, and Qatar, that are engaged in a jihad, these terrorists are far less civil, far less desirable than I am. And he's telling the truth. But of course the Saudi Arabians initiated this proxy war in Syria because they wanted to curtail the growing influence of Iran and Shiite Islam, something that America facilitated by its invasion of Iraq. And so he's speaking on behalf of Saudi Arabia, trying to dissuade people from recognizing the truth. That the Islamic terrorists that are savaging their own country and invading Syria to savage the Shia Muslims are despicable, that they are terrorists, that they are to be feared, that and they will ultimately win. They're losing now, but according to prophecy, they will ultimately prevail. And when they do, the world will be vastly more vulnerable to them. And Syria will be nothing but a heap of ruins as a result of what they will do. So this editorial continues. The regime has consistently characterized its opponents as terrorists. They are. That's the reason he's doing that, is that those who are fighting against the Assad government are almost universally, probably to the point of 97 to 99%, fundamentalist Sunni Islamic terrorists. They belong to Islamic terrorist organizations. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't engage in some guerrilla tactics. They do. But by any rational definition, they are Islamic terrorists. He is correct. And while the once peaceful Arab Spring inspired demonstrations have long morphed into armed insurrections that include a wide array of Islamist groups of varying militancy, some of the international community are allowing their all-consuming fear of terrorism to prevent them from recognizing an equally dangerous ideology that long ago engulfed the entire world in a war that cost millions of people their lives and which was responsible for unimaginable atrocities, the full scope of which is still being ascertained today. Boy, that was a long sentence, wasn't it? What he's trying to do is say, yeah, okay, so they are terrorists. I know I've set this up as that Assad is mischaracterizing them as terrorists, but yeah, okay, I'll give you that point. They really are terrorists. But are these terrorists, and they're all Islamic terrorists, really as bad as fascism, is what he's about to say? And shouldn't we be far more concerned about fascism than we are about Islam? Well, the fact of the matter is there is no distinction between fascism and Islam. Every Islamic country is a fascist state, as is Saudi Arabia. And fascism is not just a form of governance, it is a form of economic control. And what the world has never really embraced is the reality that fascism and communism are the same animal. The only difference between fascism and communism is ownership versus control. In communism, all assets are owned by the state and therefore controlled by the state. But since they're owned by the state's control is actually weaker in communism than it is in fascism. In fascism, individuals can own businesses. They can own land, where they can't in communism. But the control mechanism over their ownership, over their businesses, is far more egregious than it is in a communist society. And so the difference between owning and controlling, if you do not control, other than the accumulation of wealth, there is no purpose in owning. And so in reality, in practice, there is no difference between communism and fascism. And therefore, when you look at the world the way where it's developing, the world is not developing towards and moving towards communism. As a fact, really the only bastion of pure communism today is probably in North Korea, which is a completely failed state. There's lots of toying with socialism, but even in China, the economy in China is free enterprise. Only the political mechanisms are communist. Communism failed everywhere it was tried. Fascism actually works, but at a horrible cost. But in Islam, every Islamic country is fascist. And so this person is writing against fascism when, in fact, his own country is fascist. He goes on to say, those who have adopted the view that the Assad regime's continuation in power is the lesser of two evils should be under no illusions as to what their preferred option is, fascism. Now, I recognize that. That in Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a fascist. In Syria, Assad is a fascist. In Saudi Arabia, the Saud royal family are fascists. The same thing is true with the emir in Kuwait. The same thing is true in Qatar and Bahrain et al. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're considering a very jaundiced view here. One where this man, Fa'ad Nasser, who is a political analyst and terrorism analyst at the Saudi embassy in Washington, is trying to say that when evaluating the lesser of two evils between Islamic terrorism, and that would be the entirety of those trying to impose their will through weapons against the Assad government in Syria, and fascism, which is the economic and political form of governance deployed by virtually the entire Islamic world, including Syria, that fascism is worse than Islamic terrorism. The problem with his analysis here is that there is no distinction between fascism and an Islamic economy or Islamic patriotism, Islamic politics. On this subject, the difference, if there is one that is meaningful, between fascism and communism is my favorite wordsmith and listener to the program, Glenn. Welcome, Glenn.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Or afternoon, I guess it is now.
Yeah, it depends on what part of the country you're in. You're in Philadelphia. It is afternoon. I'm prone to say, because I did the show for so long at an earlier time slot, where I could say morning. It really was morning for all of our American listeners. But, I've given up referencing the time of day because 90% of the listeners to this program listen to the archives, and they're in countries like New Zealand and Australia and Colombia, South America, and in Britain, and they're around the world, and so time really is irrelevant when you're doing a program like this.
Right. It's amazing. Well, I've been working night shift, and I've been hammering away at paperwork here for a few hours, so it's like, nice afternoon. About the distinction between fascism and communism. Yes. I really, wrestled with, this one, and eventually the word that I came to, eventually that, the umbrella term is totalitarianism, of course.
Correct.
Both are horrifically totalitarian.
Right.
And I hear another talk show host who often says authoritarian, and it's like, no, it's not authoritarian, it's totalitarian. And,
yeah, it's a bringing together of power and an expansion of power among those who have no accountability.
Right. And there's no ambiguity whatsoever about where the United States stands, because on either side of the podium in the House of Representatives are depictions of the Roman keys, and the U.S. Congress meets on Capitol Hill, and the Roman Senate met on Capitoline Hill.
Yes.
So there's no ambiguity about the fact that the U.S. is a little carbon copy, Roman model fascist state.
Yeah, in fact, for those that are really interested in doing what you did, which is wrestling with this, because it is a myth that is important for us to understand if we want to understand where the world is going and how it's going to get there. This understanding the subtle difference between fascism and communism and how the world is headed towards fascism, not communism, is important. There's a myth in the West in particular that the fight is between capitalism and communism, but the fact is that capitalism is germane to all forms of economics. Communism and fascism are both capitalistic. All capitalism means is that capital is deployed in the economy, and capital comes in the form of three things. It's money, it's labor, which are people, and it's mechanisms. It's the means to productions, which would be factories and the like. Land, factories, those sorts of things are the means to production. All three of those elements are capitalistic, and they are manipulated in different ways, controlled in different ways, in a communism, fascism, and a free enterprise system. And free enterprise is the one that is completely different, where fascism and communism are the two which are considered extremes but are really carbon copies of each other. They're opposite sides of the same coin.
But the thing is, like, communism is so horrifically inefficient. Even in fascism, you have the element of personal benefit and initiative involved. In communism, you have the dynamic that we pretend to work and they pretend to pass. Everything becomes horrifically inefficient, overstaffed, and they make up positions that don't need to be there.
From each according to their ability, to each according to their need, is a bankrupt concept. It does not work. President Barack Obama wants to move America towards that. The new health care initiative that he has proposed and that we're under now underscores that. It does not work. It is grotesquely inefficient because there is no motivation for anybody to work under that scenario. So you're right. There's an advantage to fascism over communism, and that there's personal incentive still in fascism. But boy, to adhere to it, you give up so much, including one's freedom. We'll be back. Stay with us, Glenn.